What situations have you accepted that ultimately led to a self-fulfilling prophecy? You ended up getting what you were afraid of. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am your host, Dr. Sherman Rivers. Man truly is mine. I think, therefore, I am. Right now, I am thinking about the fear of poverty. I'm thinking about the writings of one Napoleon Hill, where he talked about the six ghosts of fear. The six ghosts of fear, the first ghost of which is the fear of poverty. This writing comes from his book, Think and Grow Rich. If you have not read that book, I would encourage you to read it. And for those who know about Mr. Napoleon Hill, they know that he has some very powerful writings out there, very powerful writings. And regardless of what you think about Napoleon Hill, the man, you can't dispute the fact that the writings of Mr. Napoleon Hill carry in them some very, very powerful truths. So, the six ghosts of fear, the first ghost of which being the fear of poverty. When we think about the fear of poverty, we have to think about the financial road that we can take in our life, or the financial roads that we can take in our life. There's really two roads. One of these roads leads to poverty, and the other one leads to riches. Let's break that down a little bit. Poverty. Let's define poverty. What is poverty? The definition of poverty is a state of having few material possessions or little income. Poverty can have diverse social, economic, and political causes and effects. This state that you could be in where you have few material possessions, little income, puts you in a state where you have little influence when it comes to social issues, economic issues. So right off the bat, that paints a picture of a pretty scary place um, to be. Think about how we see that turn up, and we'll get into this a little bit deeper, a little bit later on. But think about how you see that fear turn up. Have you ever known someone who said that they were poor when they were a child? When they were a child, they lived in poverty, but they don't really remember being poor. I was poor growing up, but I don't really remember being poor. And I believe the reason for that is because it's that fear of poverty that's actually worse than the condition itself. I'll say that again. The fear of poverty is actually worse than the condition itself. So one road leads to poverty and another road leads to riches. Okay, so what are riches? Riches, the simple definition of riches are things that make one rich. So things that represent wealth, or things that cost a lot of money. So you could say that riches consist of material possessions like cars, houses, land, things of that nature. So another way to think of these riches is to think of abundance, right? Think about that for a second. We could easily replace the road to riches with the road to abundance. And I think if we look at it like that way, it will put things in a better perspective, one that's more easily understood. A quote from Napoleon Hill. Napoleon Hill said that if a man wants to attain riches, he must refuse to accept any situation that can lead to poverty. The fear of poverty will not let him move towards riches. And I found that very interesting because at first glance you would think, or it would seem, that the opposite would be true. You would think that if somebody feared poverty, they would do everything within their power to avoid that situation. When you're afraid of something, don't you go away from it? Don't you uh, try to avoid it as much as you can? If you say you're afraid of a dog, wouldn't you try to keep from going places where there was a dog? If you're afraid of spider, wouldn't you stay away from places where you thought there might be a spider? If you were afraid of heights or fear of falling, wouldn't you avoid high places, maybe even airplanes and tall buildings, things of that nature? It would seem that people would just avoid what they're afraid of on the surface. But that's not really what happens because what we fear becomes what we think about most of the time. And what's really odd about that is if it becomes the predominant thought, then this becomes our reality at some point, usually. And we end up getting the one thing that we're afraid of, kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Have you ever seen that happen? Have that ever happened to you? Let me ask you this. What situations have you accepted? Let's go back to that quote. The fear of poverty will not let him move towards riches. Why? Because if a man wants to attain riches, he must refuse to accept any situation that can lead to poverty. Do you have a fear of poverty? Are you afraid of being poor? And if that is the case, have you absolutely refused to accept any situation that would lead toward that? Let me ask you this. Have you ever stayed on a job that you knew you were terribly underpaid, but you were so afraid of being broke that you kept the job that didn't pay you enough so that uh, you wouldn't be poor? And ultimately, you were more poor than you would have been had you moved on to something that would pay you a little bit better. What situations have you accepted? Now, when I say poverty, we're not just talking about monetary things. It's easy to get caught up in the monetary things, but there's other ways to be poor. You can be poor in terms of health. You can be poor in terms of relationships. What situations have you accepted that ultimately led to a self-fulfilling prophecy? You ended up getting what you were afraid of. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comment section. I'd be interested to hear that. I overcame this fear at one point in my own life, and I tell you how I did that. I did it, and I wouldn't really recommend this to everybody. It's kind of like when you hear building it as you fly it. If you're not ready for that, then I wouldn't recommend it because it can be pretty scary. And it can be mostly scary for people around you, people who know you. They may not understand what it is that you're doing. They don't understand where it is you're trying to go, what you're trying to accomplish, and it can be a pretty trying experience. So if you're not sure about that, then I wouldn't recommend it. But that building it while you fly it or growing your wings on the way down. But that's what I did. I was in a position, uh, in a job or career that paid pretty well. Um, a lot of people were envious of the position that I held at that time. Um, people always asking the question, "Are you hiring? What do I need to do to get a job?" Things of that nature, right? And I realized that I actually had become the job. That's what people identified me as. That's who people saw me as. That was me. I was that guy. And outside of that, I really had no identity. So if it had been just a financial thing, I think I would have stayed in that position. But it was just so much missing. I felt like I was made for something more. In most schools of thought, most people would say, "Okay, well, you search for something different, and uh, then you make that move." In my situation, I felt like I couldn't think. In fact, I couldn't think, and nothing was clear. I was so busy doing someone else's bidding, it completely consumed me. I mean, all day, every day, I was consumed. I would think about it in my sleep. Uh, it was just everywhere, right? And I thought to myself, I just need time to think. I didn't even have it figured out yet, uh, but I knew, I believed that I needed something different. I was built for something different, and if I moved towards it, it would come. Long story short, I left that job. Um, basically stepped out into the wilderness, and everything turned out all right. Everything turned out well. It was a growing experience. There was some pain there, growing pains. But ultimately, I ended up in a better position. I am in a better position. And I'm really, really happy with the decision that I made, trusting myself, trusting my knowledge, my skills, my abilities, even potential, and making that move. And things turned out great. And they're getting better every day. I was glad I made that move. Could have went the wrong, other direction. Could have went the wrong way. Sure. But I had to make that change. And had I had been so afraid of being poor or losing money, which in fact I did initially lost money, I would have never made that move. I still would have been stuck doing something I could not stand. I hated. I grew to hate. I grew to despise. I would still be there, still doing that for $1 while my life slipped away and I lost so much time. So that's just my quick story. If you have a story like that, let me know in the comment section. If it's something you're contemplating, something that you're considering, I would definitely suggest you think it through. Get some other folks' insight on this. Maybe glean from some other people's experiences. Have those conversations, but definitely give it some thought and ask yourself if the fear of poverty is holding you back from doing what you should be doing and moving into what you should be moving into. So let's talk about this fear of poverty. Let's break it down a little bit more. The fear of poverty is the first of Napoleon Hill's 6 ghosts of fear. It's also the most destructive of these ghosts. Why is it the most destructive? It's the most destructive for six reasons. It destroys 6 distinct things in you, according to Mr. Hill. One, it destroys the imagination. Imagine being so afraid of poverty that you're doing something that requires no imagination and you allow that to consume you. And you get to the point where you can't imagine anything else or imagine anything beyond that. Imagination is the engine of creation. That is literally what we were put here to do, to create. That's my belief. We were put here to create. And just to bring a little touch of religion into this, I think it's the best way to lay this out. But if you're thinking about the creation story, all right, let's assume that the creation story is real and accurate, and God created the heavens and earth. Okay, so let's not debate that. Let's just assume this to be true. If you look at that story, there's one thing that God didn't do, and that was compete. Right? There was no competition there. It was just creation. And I think that's one of the things that holds us up in life, keeps us down, is we get into this mindset where we're so engulfed with the concept of competition that we lose hold of the concept of creation. And I think one of the ways that happens is because our imagination is not tapped to the level that it should be. It's been destroyed to a degree, and that's what helps to push us in that loop. So it destroys imagination. The fear of poverty destroys imagination. Also destroys reasoning ability. Take that same example. Sometimes when we're forced to make a choice, um, our fear of being broke, our fear of not having money, our fear of being poor will cause us to make a decision that's not really in our best interest. And you may say that a reasonably prudent person wouldn't do that. But it's the fear of poverty. Think about how many people have been caught up in some type of illegal activity, say some type of narcotics dealing or something like that. You would look at this and you're saying that was really dumb. That was a really dumb decision. Why did they do that? Well, I would wager that the fear of poverty. Um, they felt like they had to do this. They had to make that money so that they wouldn't be poor, because this fear is embedded in them. And then they end up, it destroys their reasoning ability and end up making some very stupid decisions. Another thing that it does is it destroys enthusiasm. destroys enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is another very important key. Sometimes it's not always what we do, it's how we do it, right? And we should strive to do everything with enthusiasm. Often, if we can't be enthusiastic about it, then it's probably not worth doing. And if it's worth doing, it's worth being enthusiastic about. But when we face the fear of poverty, when that takes hold, it destroys that enthusiasm, and we begin to do things in a lackluster way. So the fear of poverty destroys enthusiasm. The fear of poverty also destroys willpower for some of the same reasons that I just discussed. Willpower, your ability. Let's take a closer look at willpower. Right? What is willpower? We think about, at least I used to think about willpower as strictly the ability to like maintain or sustain, that being willpower. But if you really look at the word willpower, it's the power to impose one's will. Often when you have a will to do something or you want to see something happen, it's not really easy. It takes sustaining and maintaining and staying on it and continuing and outlasting, but all of those things are just required. They're just components uh, that are needed for us to impose our will on our environment. Farmer has the will to raise a crop, then he's got some work to do on a consistent basis for an extended period of time before he reaps the fruit of his labor. That takes willpower. That takes the power to impose your one's will and to maintain those efforts over an extended period of time. Another thing that the fear of poverty destroys is self-reliability. Self-reliability. This is a huge one for me because it kind of falls under the realm of my belief system. Um, there are some tenets in my belief system that are extremely important. Three important tenets: um, self-acceptance, self-responsibility, and respect for free will. And these all help to lead to the fourth, which is self-actualization. I think self-reliability falls under the self-responsibility realm. Part of the key to self-responsibility is not asking someone to do things for you that you can and should do for yourself. That's key. Not only can you do them, but you should do them. Often there are things that meet one of those criteria and you can do it, but you shouldn't be doing it. You should pass that off or delegate that. And then sometimes there are things that you should do, but you can't do. You need more training, education, knowledge, things of that nature. But these are the things that you can and should do for yourself. Don't ask anyone to do that for you. And that ties into self reliability. And the same is true the opposite. Don't do things for people that they can and should do for themselves, because if you think about it, you're denying them the opportunity to become more self reliable. It's actually doing them harm. So the fear of poverty destroys self reliability. Um, because you're afraid of being poor, you may do some things for someone else that you shouldn't be doing, or ask people to do things for you just so you can, in your mind, avoid that poverty, and you're actually preventing yourself from growing. You're actually putting yourself in a position where you're more susceptible to that condition. And lastly, the fear of poverty leads to uncertainty. When we go back to reliability, self reliability, we become reliant on someone else. We lack imagination. All these things that I mentioned previously, what it does is it puts us in a position where our future becomes less certain because we have less control or influence or impact. For example, you have people doing things for you that you could and should do for yourself. The next thing you know, you're in a position where you're relying on activities that you can't sustain yourself. What happens when the help goes away? What happens when somebody else stops doing these things for you that you don't know how to do for yourself? Your future becomes very, very uncertain. So it leads to uncertainty. So 6 things that are destroyed: imagination, reasoning ability, enthusiasm, willpower, self-reliability, and it leads to uncertainty. All these things are results of the fear of poverty. Napoleon Hill also said that man fears poverty because it brings humility and suffering. So these are things that we want to avoid, like the plague. Another story about myself and some of the things that I've done just to grow, to force myself to grow. I used to be the vehicle that I drove used to be important to me, and that had a lot to do with how I was perceived by other people. So, long story short, I used to have a Range Rover, right? And not knocking anybody for what type of vehicle they drive. That's not the point. This was a personal thing for me. Um, and I got to a point where I needed to test myself. I needed to get to know who I was. Got rid of the Range Rover and I picked up a little pickup truck, right? Little Toyota pickup truck, Toyota Tacoma. Side note, I actually had more people compliment me on that Toyota and want to buy the Toyota from me. Uh, it seemed like everywhere I went, people loved, or they still do love that pickup truck. I still have it, more so than the Range Rover. But that's neither here nor there. What it was for me, I had to prove to myself that I could detach from these physical things. Again, it was an identity thing. And that it wasn't as important. These things, these material things weren't as important. So I bought the most basic vehicle I could find. I bought a stick shift, 5-speed Toyota pickup truck with roll up windows. They're just as basic as you could get. And turned out falling in love with the vehicle. Kept it. I don't see myself ever getting rid of it. Fell in love with the truck, but it was utility over image. And I had to prove to myself that that was something I could do. So, just a side note. Sometimes we have to test ourselves and see what's really important to us. So, here are some more symptoms or some symptoms of the fear of poverty. One is indifference. Indifference. I like to say that the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. The worst thing the worst state that somebody can be in is when they just don't care anymore. They're just indifferent about it, and that's what that fear can put us in. We become indifferent to some of the things that should matter. Indecisiveness leads to indecision, doubt, worry, overcaution, procrastination. Procrastination is a huge one. Huge one. That goes back to that. You're so afraid that you might make the wrong move that you don't make any move. We used to say, study long, study wrong. Um, but you just become frozen, basically frozen in fear, frozen in the fear of poverty, and opportunities pass you by left and right because you're afraid to um, to make that move. So it can lead to procrastination and also expecting poverty instead of demanding riches. It's a very sad state that you can get into where just imagine being beat up so bad that that's what you come to expect. You expect to be beat up. It's a very sad place to be in life, but expecting poverty instead of demanding riches. Keyword there, demanding riches. Not asking, but demanding. That's a separate video. I'll go into that in a separate video. But what would you think if I told you that you could demand, you could make demands of God? What does that sound like to you? Is that scary? Does it sound like blasphemy? Sound like I'm like my soul is in danger? Anyway, I digress. I'll get into that in a different video. But yeah, we should be making these demands. We should be demanding riches. So let's do a self-evaluation. Let's. I told you some stories about me, some of the things that I've done. But what is your current state right now? Do you fear poverty? Does anything, any of these arrows that I talked about, the fear of poverty, do any of these arrows hit you? If so, which ones? Which ones affect you? What traits have been destroyed in you because of the fear of poverty? Does it just not affect you at all? Or do you find some indication that there is some level of fear? What symptoms, if any, do you display? Are you indifferent about certain things? Do you suffer from indecision, doubt, worry, overcaution? Do these things affect you? Could it be the fear of poverty? I would suggest a good read of that book, Think and Grow Rich. If you haven't read it, if you have read it, maybe read it again. So much valuable information in there, so much powerful information. It's just these insights will actually allow you to um, self evaluate, maybe correct course on a few things. So, shout out to Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. This was the first ghost of the sixth ghost of fear, the fear of poverty. So, remember, man is mind. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. I think, therefore I am. Man truly is mine. And lastly, I'll leave you with this. Your mind is like a castle. And when a clown enters a castle, it doesn't become the king. The castle becomes a circus. Are there any clowns in your castle?